Rachel Reeves said, who is going to stand up for business? And I thought, every business in the country is going to be thinking, well, not you. There was virtually no mention of tax. When we have a budget coming up and when everyone is speculating about how big is the fiscal black hole, how much a tax is going to go up, which taxes are going to be increased. Here is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister of the sixth largest economy in the world. And she keeps talking about school breakfast clubs.
When the assumption was still that carbon emissions, that's something that developed countries impose on the rest of the world. And I think the penny has only really dropped in recent years, and actually we contribute a minor proportion.
Hello and welcome to this IEA podcast. My name is Reem, Ibrahim, and I'm the head of media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. Today we're going to be discussing the aftermath of Labour Party conference, Rachel Reeves' speech and both Ed Miliband's speech, and of course the climate change policies that we've had announced this week as well from both political parties. We're also going to be discussing the new bog-off ban on buy one, get one free. Tom, let's start off by talking about Rachel Reeves' speech. There's a lot in there and also not a lot of substance in there, so what do you think?
Yeah, and I had to listen to all of it because I was there to analyse it for GB News. It went on and on. It had more false endings than the last Lord of the Rings film. Interminable. And also, I think this is my first takeaway, actually, is kind of a political one. It was very much two speeches in one. It was almost as if they wrote two speeches and decided to give both of them and just sort of squash them together awkwardly. And so the first half of the Chancellor's speech was very much defining Labour against the Conservative. She repeated this line over and over again: don't let anyone tell you there's no difference between a Conservative government and a Labour government. And it was very much a pitch to the left. And so they were talking about really, hot button issues like nationalising steel and shipbuilding in the UK and that kind of thing, and bailing out Jaguar Land Rover. It felt very retro, actually. That was the weird bit. But I think the crucial thing is this was very much a pitch to the left of the Labour Party, and other people have observed this as well. You saw at this conference the Labour Party may be trying to consolidate their base a little bit because they've been losing a lot of voters to the Greens and to the Liberal Democrats. But then she sort of switched gear and started attacking reform and calling them sort of a threat to British values and a threat to business and a threat to fiscal stability. And at one point, Rachel Reeves said, who is going to stand up for business? And I thought, every business in the country is going to be thinking, well, not you. But that was clearly the implication, that Labour was the pro-business party. And I think there's kind of a split personality thing going on here, where simultaneously trying to define themselves against the Conservatives and pitch to the left, while also trying to paint reform as the big baddie and effectively try and unite the whole centre against reform. And, I just wonder, can you have it both ways? I don't really see how you can. And secondly, what are the policy implications of this? The policy implications are either they have to choose one or the other. Are they the centrist, pro-business, fiscally responsible party, or are they the party of the traditional left? I suppose the third alternative is they can try to muddle the two together incoherently and spend the next 4 years in government getting about as far as they have got in their first year in government. So the politics of it are interesting, but it's hard to conclude the direction that the Labour Party is going to go, or the government is going to go on this. From a more policy-oriented perspective, two things really struck me. The first one is, here is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister of the sixth largest economy in the world. And she keeps talking about school breakfast clubs. To be clear, I've got nothing against school breakfast clubs. I would think it would if the Education Secretary was dwelling so much on school breakfast clubs as the Chancellor of the Exchequer was. But what was notable was what Rachel Reeves didn't say. There was virtually no mention of tax. When we have a budget coming up and when everyone is speculating about how big is the fiscal black hole, how much a tax is going to go up, which taxes are going to be increased. Now, of course, you can say, of course, the Chancellor is going to save all of that for the budget speech and she's not going to tip her hand in advance. Okay, I get that. But I think you would expect some kind of messaging, some kind of reassurance, and you really didn't get that. And so my conclusion from the complete absence of any discussion of tax, and also the big focus on we are a party of the left, we are spending, we're strategic, we're getting involved in industrial strategy. It seems to me this is a government that is going to put kind of statism and public spending ahead of markets and ahead of taxpayer interests. Very clear to me, the lack of reassurance on tax is probably a signal that taxes are going to go up and probably going to go up quite significantly this autumn. And one final thing, and I just want to mention Ryan Bourne wrote a really good piece in the Times this week saying if you read or listen to Rachel Reeves' speech, it becomes clear that the government is kind of incapable of distinguishing between things that they find morally satisfying and things which will actually deliver economic growth. So it's great that you have the Chancellor of the Exchequer talking about economic growth and saying we're going to pursue economic growth. But then when you look at the things she's doing, they're things that any probably government of the left would want to do and that probably have almost no bearing on growth whatsoever. Bailing out failing industries, not good for growth. Investing, investment, yes, but in what? Right? Infrastructure can be helpful. It can be unhelpful. Just because the government is spending and it's capital spending doesn't mean you're going to boost growth. There's really nothing there on a kind of pro-growth deregulatory strategy, on tax reform, anything else. So, 45 minutes of my life I won't get back.
Mhm. Do you think it's sort of worse for the markets, the fact that there is that speculation around tax rises, but there isn't that clarity? And so people obviously are probably bracing themselves for those tax rises. They're obviously having to change their business plans and think about what that looks like in the midway through the financial year. And so probably also spending less than they might otherwise do if they had some clarity over what those tax rises could look like.
Well, to a certain extent. I mean, when the news is probably going to be bad news, so I'm not sure people will welcome the certainty. But uncertainty can be a killer as well. And we talk about the Great Depression and regime uncertainty and the role that had. We had a discussion about that at the IEA this week. And yes, when the thing is, when people are uncertain, when businesses can't plan, they don't know how to sort of calculate the returns on investment that they might get and so on, it tends to just freeze things in place. And that can be a very negative thing for the economy.
And thinking about this with the combined with the politics as well, Kristian. I mean, obviously, it's interesting that the conversations around growth are being had, but of course, everything that was sort of substantial that we heard from the speech this week was spending increases and had nothing to do with fiscal discipline. So, what do you make of the politics of this?
Well, it's the things they want to do anyway.
Yeah.
So their approach to growth is very much like their approach to patriotism. It's one of those running themes that they keep bringing up, but it's just a label they attach to things that they would do anyway and would have done under any circumstances. So just by saying this is about growth and this is about growth, and this is also about patriotism, and this is also about patriotism. Well, you're not really changing policies in any way. You just identify a label, a buzzword that you think is in high demand and attach it to everything. To the extent that there was anything on policy substance, there was this announcement of a job guarantee for young people, where well, a bit of an echo of the Tony Blair early years New Deal, where he also had this program that young people would get a job guarantee. The government would organize or find some activity for them, but then conditionality, they would have to take it. So the issue there is that made some sense in the Blair years, because there you really had a lot of people, specifically young people, who were on conventional wage replacement benefits, unemployment benefits. And if that's your problem, then a kind of workfare approach can work. You find activities for people who have been out of the active labor force for a while. You find some activity for them, but you tell them, look, there's two sides of this bargain. You also have to take the offer that we make. And that made some sense. As I said, in the late 90s. It made some sense in the US, where this was pioneered, the workfare approach, also in the 90s, or in some states even a bit earlier. The problem here is that, what we've seen over the past 2-3 years is a massive increase in people claiming disability and incapacity benefits. And the workfare New Deal, whatever you want to call it, that kind of approach, that's only ever worked for able-bodied people. For people who receive one of the conventional wage replacement benefits. Nobody has ever found a way, as far as I know, of applying that to people on disability or incapacity benefits, because there the whole point is that the work requirements, the work search requirements, are either completely suspended or they're watered down, and you cannot credibly say, look, if you don't take this offer, there's going to be a sanction and a cut in the benefits that you receive. And therefore, this is where the whole workfare New Deal approach has never been applied and never worked. So therefore, she's uh, diagnosing the problem in the wrong way. So of course there are some people there has been some uptick in youth unemployment, and maybe for a few people her job guarantee is going to make a difference, but that's not where the big increase in economic inactivity is coming from. So this is a recipe for a completely different era and a different labor market situation.
And I think there's an interesting kind of incoherence here as well, actually, because if your goal is trying to get more young people into work, and, it was very lofty ambition to the complete abolition of youth unemployment, I think she said during the speech, and yet you've made it much more expensive to employ young people by kind of leveling up the minimum wage. There used to be a reduced minimum wage for younger people. That's being abolished, and the minimum wage itself is extremely high, so you've made them more expensive. Also, with the employer national insurance contributions, again, that's added to the cost of hiring people. Particularly, it's had an impact at the lower end of the wage scales as well. Add to that the fact that the government is hell-bent on making it much more risky to employ someone, especially someone without a proven work history, by giving them protection from unfair dismissal claims from day one and a whole lot more workplace benefits from day one as well. We've seen, I think it's 150,000 jobs in the last year or 6 months or something go in hospitality, where a lot of young people might work casually, might get their start, might get an entryway into the workforce. So in so many other respects, they are creating a youth unemployment problem, or at least they are creating the kind of policy environment which has led to big youth unemployment problems in continental Europe. And simultaneously, with no new money, by the way, they're saying we are going to abolish youth unemployment. This is all over the place.
It is, and it's also just sort of taking into consideration exactly the manpower and the cost of all of this. I mean, obviously, if you are to think about benefits as a cash transfer, the money being spent on the sort of transactional costs of that is a little bit lower. Whereas for a scheme like this, yet another government-led employment scheme, what ends up happening is you have to hire all of the civil servants that cost the scheme. You've got to instill all of those individuals. You also have to then, I think they say they're going to fund part and subsidize part of the wages. There's no clarity about who those businesses are, where these jobs are going to come from in the first place, and what the unintended consequences of those particular job placement schemes look like.
That's one of the problems with programs of that kind. So you can't fundamentally affect the labor market in that way. If the problem is the best that you can hope for, the best you can achieve in that way is a better matching of supply and demand. That if you have a mismatch, employers looking for a particular type of skill, and somehow the people who might have that skill now or might develop it in the future just somehow not finding together, then okay, maybe a program can help in the best circumstances. But if you have what you mentioned, if you make it riskier and more expensive to hire people, and especially young people, inexperienced people, if you discourage that risk, and if you just have less labor demand or less demand for a particular type of labor, then improving the matching process can only get you so far. So that's why, again, this is a misdiagnosis of the situation that we have. The original workfare proposals come from a time when there really was the potential for full employment. You had labor markets generally performing well. You just had some groups who had been outside of the active labor force for so long that they were not benefiting from it. And that's when you needed some extra push to somehow connect the people with the jobs. But of course, you can't create extra demand for particular types of skills and experiences in that way.
Because this is the point, right? The government should absolutely look in the mirror if they want to figure out exactly why we have a worklessness crisis. I mean, as you've said, Tom, the fact that we have an increase in national insurance contributions for employers, which means that it's more expensive to employ people, an increase in the minimum wage, which means it's way more expensive to employ somebody on the bottom end of the pay spectrum. And of course, the Employment Rights Bill coming into play, which means it's going to be so much more difficult and so much riskier to employ those people. But also, this is all part of the broader problem here, that we haven't experienced economic growth. We experienced 0.2%, I believe, in the 3 months to July, no growth in July. It's absurd when we're thinking about this from a wider perspective. Why are we seeing loss in vacancies and, reduction in all of these opportunities for younger people? It's because, yes, there are these specific policies that are hurting those particular vacancies. But also, if we don't have a growing economy, then it's going to be entirely impossible for us to have those opportunities available for people. And it's absurd. I mean, the fact that in the first year of somebody being out of work, there is only a 3.8% chance they will ever go back to work. It is so shocking. And I think that we have to have these wider conversations about what that looks like. So I think that whilst these schemes might sound great, it is nothing new. We have already had so many different employment schemes come into play in the first place. And this is just going to cost a huge amount of money and doesn't take into consideration the root cause of the problem, which is we don't experience economic growth.
No, and you're absolutely right. That is the fundamental issue here. And I think there's an interesting contrast to be drawn. In the United States, they often talk about post-2008 as a jobless recovery. So the economy kind of bounced back, or at least it returned to its pre-crisis trend line, but they didn't create as many jobs at the time as they were expecting or as they wanted to. I think in a way, what we experienced in the UK was plenty of jobs, but no recovery. And so this is, it's sort of part and parcel of this long decline in productivity growth in the UK that probably through the 2010s, Conservative government and the coalition were often very pleased and boasting about high levels of employment, labour market participation, low levels of unemployment and so on. But the flip side of that was you weren't getting much output from a big labour force. So effectively, less output per hour worked, or at least you weren't getting any growth in that. And now I wonder if, the penny has dropped a little bit in some respects. And now not only are we not getting the growth, but we're seeing the fall in employment as well, post-pandemic.
And Kristian sort of alluded to this. I mean, part of the problem is that a lot of it is due to long-term sickness. Mostly that increase is due to mental health. I think it's about 69% of new claimants since the pandemic claim their primary issue, their primary health concern is mental health. And, again, with young people, it's what's really worrying, because I think there was an NHS Confederation study that said that between 2021 and 2022, 63,000 people went from being economically inactive because they were students to then immediately being economically inactive because they were long-term sick. Now, if you're one of those young people, 18 months is way too long out of work. And with this particular scheme, if you're being told, yes, we will start to pull the stick out when after 18 months of you being out of work, that's already far too long. And the likeliness, as we know from so many of the statistics, the likeliness of that person going back to work into full-time employment is really, really low, especially that the longer that period is.
I just think that the health stuff, long-term sickness stuff is mostly a red herring. I'm sure that there has been some increase post-pandemic. It would make sense if people maybe have some more personal problems and mental health problems after that experience. But let's face it, most of this is people being diverted from the ordinary benefits system into the health and disability related benefits system, because we made it much easier to claim those benefits during the pandemic, because we made the assessments much less rigorous. And this is, you can trace this back decades. You clamped down on standard working age welfare and you tended to get a big increase in incapacity benefits. You push down on the incapacity benefits, it pops up somewhere else. Fundamentally, there is just an economic growth problem and a labour market problem, and a problem of just incentives in the welfare system that we need to tackle in a much more kind of comprehensive and overarching way.
And that was also the problem with the original workfare reforms in the US, even Wisconsin, which was the pioneer in the 80s and then rolled out in the rest of the country in the 90s. Even there they had the issue was that these reforms worked as far as they went. So talking about inactivity among, in principle, able-bodied people, you really do see a big decrease in the welfare claimant roles. But nonetheless, overall employment rates, even after the reforms, were not fantastic. And the reason is that you also had people who were inactive because they claimed various forms of disability benefits, and their workfare cannot be applied. That requires a separate reform, and that's precisely what they've already U-turned on. That's exactly what they were trying to do at first. and then decided, oh no, that's too difficult, that's too contentious, let's just factor that out completely, and let's focus on the easy bit and have a big program around that. But that's really not where the major problem is.
The conclusion here is if you want young people in employment, you don't need a government-led employment scheme. What you need is a growing economy in which wages are growing and people are able to actually employ people in a free and dynamic labour market.
Yep.
So let's talk about the climate change sort of announcements that we've seen over this week when it comes to energy. So Ed Miliband, I quite enjoyed part of his speech where he was saying that we're going to send the frackers packing. And it's interesting, he sort of said in his speech at Labour Party conference that they want a complete ban on fracking because of how awful it is for the environment. Although we sort of already have a de facto ban on fracking anyway because it's almost impossible to do under current regulations. Tom, what do you make of that announcement and also Kemi Badenoch's response, which was to say that they're going to get rid of the Climate Change Act?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think on the Miliband front, I mean, these are just words. This is something to get an applause line at the Labour Party conference because, as you say, fracking isn't happening anyway. I think, frankly, there has been so much policy uncertainty around fracking. And, also when you look at the big windfall taxes that have been applied to oil and gas extraction in the North Sea and so on, no one is going to invest in fracking in the UK at this moment in time anyway, even if it were possible to get the permits for it. I think you would need to have a much more stable regime and some certainty if people were going to come in and take those risks, because after all, this is an exploratory kind of technology. We don't really know how much shale gas is down there for the most part. So you need risk and then you need reward. And I think basically we've ramped up the risks of doing it in the UK, and people are not going to be sure that they're going to see any reward on the other end. I think this is a great shame because, if you look at the impact that shale gas and fracking has had in the US, it's been immense in terms of reducing their energy bills. And I think that's been part of the US growth story in recent years. Yes, it's a much larger or less densely populated country, but I think a lot of the fear and the scaremongering around fracking is exactly that. Actually, it's based more on myth than on reality. I mean, of course, there are always downsides to anything like this. All kinds of extractive industries will have some downsides that people will experience, but you're not getting flames shooting out of taps. You're not triggering earthquakes in a significant way, and all of that stuff. That was massively overblown. And I think there probably are opportunities for fracking in maybe in many parts of the UK, maybe particularly in parts of the UK that are maybe post-industrial, that could use some kind of new economic impetus to get them going. And I think it would benefit us to have more, domestic gas production, cheaper, and more secure and all of that. But it wasn't going to happen anyway. The speech doesn't really change anything. But it is an example of an opening divide in politics between the government and the left, who are still very, very committed to the sort of net zero agenda. And I think the political right and probably most of the public, even the not particularly politically engaged public, who are getting increasingly fed up with all of this stuff, because I think that their enthusiasm for it was always skin deep, to the extent that people actually thought about climate change at all when they were asked about environmental questions. I was always slightly skeptical of that. I think that people think about things like recycling and the natural environment, and probably they think about house building in the countryside when they're posed environmental questions. Climate change is something which is a little bit more abstract, and they're happy to go along with measures to deal with it in the abstract until it starts hitting them in the wallet. And I think what we've seen in recent years is they're being hit in the wallet in a very serious way, and they're kind of getting fed up with it. And so Kemi Badenoch's announcement is interesting in that context.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Tom. It's interesting. The environment tends to be something that people care about in theory, but when it comes to the genuine business costs, I mean, thinking about the fact that in the UK we have some of the highest industrial energy costs, I think the second highest domestic energy costs in Western Europe, and it's pretty important to have those in the Western world. Sorry, I think it's really important to have those conversations because that doesn't just have an impact on your petrol in your car. It has an impact on businesses. It has an impact on investment decisions. It has a wholesale impact on that. And I think when we're looking at this and comparing the UK to the US, where petrol is about half the price, even in places like California, which have increased taxes on those kind of products significantly. And it's still so much more expensive in the UK. I find it absolutely extraordinary that the sort of, I suppose it's called the politics of privilege in a way, the idea that we're going to ban fracking and restrict supply so stringently, and there's no real clear pathway towards deregulation when it comes to things like other sources of energy like nuclear. Are we going to have a whole new government-led plan for nuclear energy? There isn't a real plan for what the next increase in supply looks like. So I can imagine that energy costs are just going to continue to increase. When Ed Miliband was initially talking about the cost of living and the cost of energy costs in the UK were about half what they are now. So it's, I think we're just going to continue down that quite negative pathway.
Yeah, but this was always going to happen. That there was going to be a wake up moment. So you had when the climate emergency was declared, I think 7 years ago, it was in response to all these Extinction Rebellion protests around here. This was always framed as something that some companies, some big fossil fuel companies, are imposing on the rest of us, the emissions, but it has nothing to do with us. So you could get the impression that this is just, carbon emissions is something that just makes a few fossil fuel billionaires even richer, but the average Joe, it has nothing to do with us, and therefore it doesn't concern us. You can just shut down a handful of polluting industries, and that will be that. And of course, now we realize, well, okay, yes, the average Joe doesn't usually dig fossil fuels out of the ground, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean
They don't use energy. Yeah.
Well, exactly.
It's so funny. We are also one of the largest importers of oil and gas. Like, yeah, we're not fracking in the UK, but we are still importing it elsewhere.
But fracking isn't even that bad from an environmental or decarbonization perspective. It's one of the reasons why in the US, I think that CO2 emissions have actually fallen, if from a very high basis, but nonetheless, it's not that they suddenly switched to or joined Extinction Rebellion and Just the Oil or whatever their equivalent is called en masse. It's more like it depends on what fracking replaces, because there are, of course, if it in so far as it replaces coal and oil, it is a cleaner technology. Of course, in so far as it replaces nuclear or solar energy, okay, that's a different story. But it is not a particularly environmentally damaging way of producing energy. And even to the extent that it is, we shouldn't forget that. So even if we abolished the 2008 Climate Change Act today, that would not mean that we wouldn't have a climate policy anymore. Climate policy, Britain has had something that you can describe as a climate policy in the broadest sense since the late 80s. Even then, they were already fairly small at the time, but there were some levies on fossil fuel production and energy. And Britain joined the European emissions trading scheme in, I think, 2003, 4, or well, so when it was launched at the EU level. So right from the start, this was 5 years or so before the Climate Change Act, that would still be there. There would still be a form of addressing the externalities. You would still have carbon pricing. There would be no going back to a situation where you can just emit as much carbon as you want. You'd still have a system where you need permits to do that. It's a tightly regulated activity, and where the total amount is capped. And that means that if you increase emissions somewhere in the economy, whether that's from fracking or something else, you have to decrease them somewhere else. And once you have a cap on the overall amount, you don't need to worry about this particular carbon-intensive technology or that particular carbon-intensive technology. We have an overall cap and trade system in place. Just leave it there and do nothing else.
And it would also mean that it's a much more neutral system. I mean, what we need is a competitive market in energy. And so the competitive market can then have a conversation, decide exactly what energy is actually the most efficient. The problem is the current situation. We've got the government subsidizing specific green energy companies and basically picking winners and losers. And so we're actually slowing ourselves down in getting there. Like, climate change is very real, but I'm a climate change optimist. I think that we are going to be able to find technologies that are much more efficient, but we're not going to get there if the government continuously involves itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's an important point to draw the distinction between the Climate Change Act or net zero, which is a very particular way of pursuing decarbonisation, and the goal of decarbonisation in general. And so, what the legislation, the Climate Change Act, has done effectively is create, first of all, a specific target for a specific year, which is kind of arbitrary. It was an 80% reduction at first, and then it was upgraded to net zero later. It's put in place this whole kind of institutional architecture around the Climate Change Committee and their 5-year carbon budget. And it's really, in a sense, it's created this whole of government objective where everything, even stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with climate or shouldn't have anything to do with climate, has to be seen through this lens. And so I think it's a very pernicious policy, and it gets the government into really large-scale industrial planning and picking winners, or we should probably call it picking losers. Different technologies and everything like that. This is not something that government should do. It's not something government is good at, and they would be right to get out of the business of doing it. Where it's not a big disagreement, but a slight disagreement with Kristian is that I probably would get rid of the cap and trade, and I'd much rather go to a much more comprehensive, coherent carbon tax and do it in a particular way. So levy it as far upstream as possible for simplification reasons. And then basically I would take all of the revenue you collect from your carbon tax, whatever level you want to set it at to achieve the decarbonisation, and I would just hand that back to people as a kind of flat rate carbon credit. So I think what you're doing then is you're not necessarily raising the cost of living for people because they're getting the cash back, but you're shifting relative prices so that things that are more carbon intensive will become relatively more expensive compared to things that aren't. And that's just a way that government can sort of put its thumb on the scales and tilt the market and encourage innovation through the price system towards less carbon intensive options. But as you say, you're neutral towards technology.
Yeah.
Just one thing I'll add on this before we move on is that the IEA's got, I think, some interesting research coming up on this. We've got papers looking at whether you should just stop drilling for oil and gas in the UK at the overall costs of net zero, and also attempting to this will take a little bit longer, but trying to quantify the impact that energy and environmental policies and basically the rising price of energy as a result has had on economic growth in the UK. Because I think we know it's a significant, or we've got a strong instinct that it's a significant contributor, but exactly how much of an impact it's had and how is something we don't fully grasp yet. And I think it's important to understand that to work out the best way to move forward in policy terms.
Your small addition to that, I'd be completely okay with replacing the emissions trading system with a carbon tax. I'm just saying that the general principle of pricing carbon in order to address externalities, that is older than the climate change.
Yes.
That is older than having specific targets for specific years. That came much later, and you can have one without the other. You can say we address the externalities and we have a climate policy if it means that. But we don't get into the central planning of saying by this year it must be that percentage of the baseline level of that other year. And where you also then have the problem that this comes from a time when the assumption was still that carbon emissions, that's something that developed countries impose on the rest of the world. And I think the penny has only really dropped in recent years, that actually we contribute a minor proportion, a minor fraction to overall global emissions, now less than 1%. So even in 2008, when the climate change was passed, even then the idea was the idea that the developed, the OECD countries, that they are the big polluters. That was out of date even then. Today, we've moved even further away from that. And I know environmentalists hate it when you bring that up because they see that as just a way of deflecting attention, of saying, oh, well, it's not my problem. Let's talk about all these other polluters. But, well, there are many things in between saying, okay, we will unilaterally shut down everything regardless of what the rest of the world does. And
Just stupid.
saying we'll wait until the rest of the world acts. We can do some things, but not a limitless amount.
The point is, we can have carbon pricing or some form of carbon pricing without having a legally binding, completely arbitrary net zero target that fundamentally makes us poorer.
And all of the government planning that goes along with that.
Absolutely. Let's talk about bog off. Buy one, get one free. So the government had this is sort of a legacy policy that had been delayed and delayed and delayed because of the cost of living crisis. But now that the cost of living crisis is over, we can now have this policy in order to make us all healthier. So we're going
Goodbye, cost of living crisis.
to
Hello, obesity crisis.
obesity crisis.
Always some crisis.
There is always
Food inflation's still over 5%, by the way.
Yes, obviously I was joking. The cost of living crisis still is happening, and things are still very, very much so expensive, especially when wages aren't catching up to that. So what we are seeing is foods that are, I guess, HFSS, high in fat, sugar, and salt, will be restricted from and completely banned from these buy one get one free supermarket deals. Now, one of the parts of this that I think is just completely extraordinary is that, of course, the HFSS category is completely arbitrary. A lot of those foods that are included in that, yes, do have pretty unhealthy for you, but it also includes things like yogurt and a lot of breakfast cereals and chicken nuggets, some pizzas. What really surprises me by this policy is, of course, a lot of the foods that actually are included in it tend to be what children eat. So what the government are doing for millions of families across the country is making it more expensive for them to put food on the table to feed their children. How is this being implemented under a Labour government especially?
Well, I think that's a crucial point. Implemented, but this is a Conservative
It is,
government
yeah.
policy that was delayed because of the cost of living crisis, which obviously is over now. We can all recognise that. So now is the perfect time to add, according to the, I think, Public Health England, £634 onto the average family's food bill over the year. That's assuming that they carry on buying the same stuff, by the way, and that this doesn't have the effect of making everyone eat more healthily, which I think, based on the success rate of previous anti-obesity interventions, is actually a fairly safe bet. And our colleague Christopher Snowden made this point on X this week, or no, it was in the Critic magazine, I think, that shouldn't we look back and see if all of the other things that we've done to try and combat obesity have been helpful? Like, have they had any meaningful, measurable effect whatsoever? Because we're always told, well, we need to do this next thing. Of course, that won't be enough. There's lots of other things you need to do. But if we're not making progress on the basis of these policies, why are we doing them at all? I think effectively what this stuff does is it punishes people who are perfectly healthy and responsible, but who might enjoy some high in fat, salt and sugar food, tasty food, let's call it, every now and again.
I love chicken nuggets.
They have to pay more for the same things they wanted and that weren't causing any problems anyway. The people maybe where there is a problem aren't going to change their behavior significantly as a result of these kind of measures. So ultimately, what is the point? I think the point is that you just have a massive interest activist lobby, which is pushing for this stuff against the evidence or in the absence of evidence. Often these are sort of sock puppet campaigns where the government is funding NGOs to lobby them to introduce regulations which raise prices for consumers and have no, as I say, meaningful positive impact at all anyway. Also, this all just feels very 2020 to me, when we have, Ozempic and Manjaro, like we actually have quite credible and proven ways to deal with obesity. Maybe we can just let people live their lives for a change.
And you know what does have an impact on life expectancy and health? Economic growth. Every time you look at, and this is something that I've got from the Nanny State Index, because in recent editions we've started including a graph that compares how nanny status European countries are and whether or not they have increased life expectancy, and it has no correlation. How big a nanny status the government is has no correlation whatsoever to how healthy the country actually is. But what does have an impact on people's health is economic growth. It is wealth. If people are wealthier, they are more likely to have the opportunity to look after themselves. So if you want better public health, stop regulating things so much, stop making things more expensive, but instead focus on economic growth.
And ahead of my cheap Kit Kats.
Yeah.
Ideally, yeah. This is the sort of thing, it's not that in itself is going to slow down growth. Well, okay, there isn't much to slow down to begin with, but it's not, I don't think the OBR is going to revise their forecast in the base of that policy, but it's just, you get this in every area that, yes, on the one hand, they say economic growth, that's what we want to be judged on, that's our guiding mission, and just never, when it conflicts with anything else, and in every area, they want to come up with some fiddly stuff. And in this particular case, even though, okay, yes, the regulatory burden again, it's not going to be reflected in GDP figures as such, but it's just the kind of solution in search of a problem. What is that trying to achieve? They are starting from the wrong assumption, probably coming from the sock puppets, that from the nanny state campaigners, that the consumer, there's just this assumption that the consumer has no agency. It's not that we choose to buy things because we find them tasty or good value for money or something else that we value as consumers. We just passively, we're just guided by signals, and they mess with our brains. And the supermarkets have just this enormous power to push anything they want onto us. And this is just complete nonsense from the supermarket's perspective, or any retailer or food producer. They don't care whether we want green beans and broccoli or chicken McNuggets. They just respond to what the consumer wants, and consumers have preferences. And of course, these preferences can change. Sometimes you see things that you weren't aware existed before, and that's entrepreneurship and all that. But nonetheless, we form our preferences, and by changing policy, we can't be easily guided from this type of consumption to a different one. And therefore, the reason why politicians keep doing this is, and I haven't seen YouGov surveys yet on this, but I bet there will soon be a survey saying, again, 60% of the public love it, or at least approve of it.
Because I can't control myself. When I see these buy one get one free deals, I just have to buy all the Kit Kats.
Well, what it does, it's what I've described as anti-producerism. The idea that rather than anti-consumerism, that we buy too much trashy stuff that we don't need, it's somehow you present these policies as something that only affects the producer, as with net zero, as the assumption that net zero only hurts 100 fossil fuel producers. In this case, you frame it in a way as if this only hurts a few big supermarkets or
right.
big food.
I was on Channel 5 this week discussing this, and I was on with a guy from Novara Media who made these exact points. He said, well, you're talking about consumer freedom, but I think you just really care about the profits of the big companies. And it's like, what
I'll rely
about
Novara Media.
But what I find it absolutely extraordinary, there are people that claim that they care about reducing poverty and alleviating poverty and making things easier for families, go full-fledged in support of basically policies that were born out of a moral panic around obesity that will literally make things more expensive for families across the country. I find it extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, I think people sometimes ask, why do you talk about these issues? It seems like an odd fit, but I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, we are actually libertarians, and so we do care about freedom in general and lifestyle freedom, and I think there's an economic angle to this as well, a significant one. Secondly, we have Chris Snowdon on our staff, and he's pretty much the best person in the country on these issues, probably the best person in Europe. We can even spread it wider. Good for you, Chris. And you were accused, I think, on national TV of being in the pocket or in the pay of big junk food. I don't know that there is actually big junk food.
Who is big junk food?
If there is,
I would like to contact them.
I would quite like them to support the work of the Institute of Economic Affairs, but that's not happening at the moment, to my knowledge. So, but I think the real reason why these issues are important is because I see the nanny state, sometimes called the bully state, and I think that's a better term for it, as kind of the tip of the regulatory state iceberg. So it's the bit that's most visible. It's maybe the bit that is sort of the most extreme and the most developed, but actually there are tendencies there which are present across our regulatory bureaucratic apparatus. And it's the kind of the abuse of evidence or ignoring the evidence. So, yes, do these anti-obesity measures without determining whether they actually have any impact on obesity. It's sort of similar to when you introduce a second staircase rule, even though the cost of doing that is several hundred times more than the benefits that are going to accrue. I think the role of activists and interest groups who are often state-funded in driving policy, which is against the public interest and frankly not something the public is very interested in generally. Again, I think that's something you see commonly across the regulatory state as a whole. And also, you just have this relentless ratchet effect where one regulation is piled on another. And every time it's, this is very reasonable. Only someone who is some kind of corporate capitalist shill could be opposed to this. Every right-thinking person will surely think this is just a sensible step in the right direction. A, nonsense, but B, if you keep pulling that trick over and over and over again, you end up with this nightmarish bureaucratic leviathan. And I think increasingly that's just what we see around us.
Of course, the reason why they do it is that they've given up on meaningful health reform. So this is a substitute for that. Wes Streeting initially marketed himself as the big reformer, as somebody who wasn't just going to do what some
spending increases.
yeah, so what previous Labour politicians may have done, which is just to praise the NHS and throw money at it. He said, no, we have to think differently about health and blah, blah, blah. I've always had my suspicions about that. I think, well, okay, he says that in the abstract because right now we're in a situation where the conventional rhetoric doesn't go down as well as it would have, say, in 2020 with people clapping on the doorstep for the NHS. That mood has shifted a bit.
Pans.
Yes, that's now over. No pots and pans for a while. But nonetheless, there was never any follow-up, any actual reform agenda emanating from that. And it's often the case that when healthcare politicians in particular, when they don't know what to do with the actual health service, they switch to nanny statism instead. And then they say, rather than trying to change the way we organize healthcare, let's just focus on what the supermarkets are doing and where they're placing their chocolate bars and how big they are. And this is just a refuge.
Where we're going, we don't need healthcare. That's the idea. If everyone was healthy, wouldn't be a problem for self-healthy.
It's gone mad. If you want the public to be healthier, grow the economy. That's my 2 cents. Tom, Kristian, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you to all of you wonderful people for joining and listening. If you are interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then do check out insider.iea.org.uk.